Behringer provided me with an early look at this wing rack. As soon as I saw the 24 local pre's and the 8 local outs, along with the normal features of the wing, I realized just how well suited it was to be a mixer in an IEM rig. So for this video, I want to talk about the settings and options for using this as a dedicated IEM mixer, followed by the steps necessary to build out this 16-space Gator G-TOUR rack provided by Sweetwater into a touring in-ear monitor rack. And we'll look at some options that are available by adding the Midas Stage Connect boxes into the system. As we start, you'll notice the wing rack has the same basic touchscreen GUI as the full-size wing. And we have all the same flexibility as the full-size wing in the wing rack. The downloadable computer software from Behringer, Wing Edit, follows the same basic GUI. So let's get started. The first thing I'd recommend doing is going into Setup and initializing the console. That way, you don't end up with any stray settings that might have been made previously. In the General tab, you should see the Initialize option here. Another window will come up. Since we want to start from scratch, click the All option. Now click the Initialize button, and that will reset the console. This gives us a default baseline state of the console to start from. While still in Setup, click the Audio tab. I'm going to go ahead and change the solo system to Live. While I'm not sure it does anything different in this particular version of the firmware, typically the solo function in live settings will be used differently than it would be in studio settings. So let's just set it to live. Let's also turn off the auto mixing feature, since that is primarily for conference audio. Now click back to Home. Let's look at these default bus assignments. Click the Buses button. Now we can see the master faders for our buses. The wing has 16 stereo buses, though you can use any of them as mono buses if you're not needing stereo. This is different from the X32 and the M32, where the buses are mono, and to use stereo, we needed to link and use 2 buses for a stereo mix. Of course, you still need to use 2 outputs for stereo. You'll need an output for the left and an output for the right for stereo outputs. The wing has 16 stereo buses available as channel sends, which is where we will get our monitor sends on the channels. Looking at our default settings, here we have 8 buses all set to tap point. And then we have 2 buses set to subgroup. And finally, the last 6 buses set to post fader. Post fader could be used as an effects bus. The tap point setting tells us the channel sends for a particular bus can be set to various optional tap points and normally at some point pre-fader, which is what you'll typically want for monitors. We finalize our tap point selection on the channels. So I will discuss that when we get to the input section of this video. For a dedicated monitor console, you're probably not going to be using subgroups. Therefore, we can change these 2 subgroups to something more useful. If we need more than 8 monitor mixes, then we can change these to tap point. That would instantly give us 2 more monitor mixes. Keep in mind though, there's only 8 local outputs available to us. Without an external box of some kind, we're limited to 4 stereo outputs or 8 mono outputs, or some combination between the 2 that totals 8 outputs. For a lot of bands, 8 outputs will be plenty. Members of a 4-piece band could all 4 have stereo in-ear monitors. Or an 8-piece band could all have 8 mono in-ear monitors. But outputs and inputs are expandable. We'll talk about how later in this video. To change a default subgroup to a monitor bus, turn its fader down for now, click the bus, click here, and change to tap point. Since we're starting from scratch, we can answer no on this pop-up. We don't need it to change anything that we're not in control of here. Lastly, click here. Since this is no longer a subgroup, let's turn off the signal being sent to the main bus. You can also change the color and name these while we're here. If you don't need extra monitor buses, then we could also set them to post fader, and that would make them available to set up as effect sends. And you could do that for any of the buses if you don't need them for monitor mixes. Or we could just leave them unchanged and unused. Before we leave this section, we can change any of the buses from the default stereo to mono as needed. Click on the bus you want to change, click back to here, and here you can see the mono option. Click it to set the bus to mono. For this example, I'll make mixes 1 through 6 mono, and mix 7 will be stereo. Which stereo is the default, so we'll just leave it unchanged. Mix 8 will be unused. Alright, now let's take a look at our physical output routing. Press the routing button. This is the output icon. By default, the console outputs are routed for 6 mono monitor mixes and a stereo main left-right mix. Since we're setting this up as a dedicated monitor console, we don't need a main left-right mix. If you were doing 6 mono monitor mixes, you'd be set as is, and you could even ignore that main output. But for our example, I need to assign 2 outputs for our stereo mix 7. Before we can change the routing, make sure the lock icon is set to unlocked. I like enabling the +1 option so that when I make a change, the software goes ahead and automatically moves to the next option. Make sure our output source is set to buses. We want to make mix 7 be stereo. We know outputs 7 and 8 are currently assigned to be the main left-right outputs. Click on the first output we want to change. Then on the right side, click on the bus that you want to assign it to. In this case, bus 7 left. As soon as that is assigned, the software in +1 mode moves to the next available local output, output 8. Since we need a right side feed for our stereo mix 7, we need to tap bus 7 right. Now our stereo mix 7 is patched to the local outputs 7 and 8. And now let's look at the input routing. Press the routing button, and this is the input icon. But we want to go ahead and get to the channels icon. Essentially, on the left is our channels, and inside each box it denotes what source is currently feeding it. This is all the exact same as it would work on the full-size wing. Once again, using the default configuration, this will already be what a lot of people will want just as it is. We have 24 local inputs in the back assigned in order to 24 virtual faders. If we connect a mic to input 1, we can adjust the gain and see signal in channel 1. Testing. 1, 2, 3, 4. Testing. 1, 2, 3, 4. It's possible you might have a stereo source like a stereo keyboard. Since the wing utilizes channels that can be mono or stereo, we don't have to link and waste 2 faders for a stereo source. Let's say we want our stereo keyboard at channel 11. We still need 2 inputs for that stereo keyboard, but we just need the 1 fader. Make sure the lock icon is unlocked. And once again, I'm going to use the +1 option. Since we want to use the local inputs, that is what we should have called up here. If we click channel 11, the first input of our stereo source, and then tap the stereo button above the local inputs on the right, we now have 2 inputs for our stereo keyboard. But they still are using 2 faders at this point. We need to reassign the channels so that the channel 11 fader is stereo using local inputs 11 and 12, and the next available fader will now be assigned to local input 13. Click the very next channel, and then on the right, click input 13. You should see now, on the left, Channel 11 is the only stereo fader, and the next channel is using input 13. We can now do this for the rest of our faders and move everything down one spot to account for the local inputs 11 and 12, feeding a stereo channel 11 on the console. After assigning the 24th input, we can click None for the last fader slot since we're out of local inputs. If you're using something like a DL32 via AES50 to expand the channel count, then you would assign those inputs to channels in the same manner. Just select the AES50 port in the Source Group option. Let's go back and set our master monitor outputs to Unity. So let's press the Home button. Press the button of the buses that we're using, and then slide their faders up to Unity. In this example, buses 1 through 6 are our mono monitor mixes, and bus 7 is our stereo mix. 8 is unused. Now we can go back to our channels. Let's select 1 through 8. In Wing Edit software, the Home button option will give us a detailed look at a selected channel. The Mix View button will give us a more big picture view of all the channels. On the rack itself, we don't have the Mix View option. But in either case, this section will call up our channel sends. On Wing Edit, here is the box that you'll want to click to get to a selected channel's bus sends. And here you can see where the tap point option comes into play. There are several tap points available. If we were doing monitors from front of house, we would likely want to move this earlier in the chain so certain settings for front of house don't impact monitors. But for a dedicated monitor console, we can set things specifically for the performers and only affect the monitors. So the default tap point 5, is a solid option and one I'd personally be using more times than not. Here we can see all 16 bus sends for a selected channel. If I turn on a bus and bring the bus fader up, then the channel will come up in that monitor mix. Alright, selecting our channel. Setting our gain. Gain 1, 2, gain, 1, 2, 1, 2, hey. I'm bringing up channel 1 in monitor mix 1. Coming up, monitor bus 1, coming up, monitor mix 1, coming up. And yes, I can use an encoder instead of a virtual fader. In fact, there are several physical buttons and encoders on the Wing Rack. If you're using Wing Edit software, you can use Sends on Faders mode. In the Master section, click the mix that you want to see or adjust, and now all the faders become channel sends for that chosen mix. The software clearly tells you that you're in Sends on Fader mode and which mix you're looking at. If you've set up any effects buses, this also works for the effects sends. When you're finished in this mode, just click the main left-right button. Now that we've looked at the Wing Rack and the software settings, it's time to take a longer look at the hardware and building our Gator Rack out into a couple of different configurations. We'll talk about those expansion options in this section as well. One of the first things you'll need for any dedicated monitor console is a splitter, whether for in-ear monitors or wedges. The splitter is what divides the band's inputs on stage with both the monitor console and the front of house console. Essentially, it allows every mic to feed 2 places. One of the simplest ways to do that is with an analog splitter snake. I purchased this ProRec 24-channel splitter for this build. It has 24 inputs and it has 2 multi-pair cables on the rear. A 5-foot tail that stays connected to the wing rack, and a 30-foot tail that connects to a venue's audio snake. A couple of points to mention here. Number 1. You should always take time to bundle the tails in groups of 4 when you first get your snake. Not only does that help to keep the ends from tangling, but it makes them easier to sort when the venue tech is connecting your tails to the house snake. Number 2, you should label the tails that go to front of house via the source, not the numbers, like kick, snare, hat, toms, and so forth. And the venue tech probably doesn't even know your names, so label things like the guitar amps and vocalist by stage position, not the musicians' names. Since the wing rack has this handy tilt feature on the front, it only makes sense to put it near the top of the rack. One thing I've done on this build is to put a rack drawer that opens to the rear in the first space. On the front, I've taken a panel mount Ethercon pass-through connector and mounted it on a rack mount knockout panel. This will connect inside the rack to the wing rack and allow me to connect my router or a computer directly to the wing rack via this front panel. The very next spot in the rack is the wing rack. Under this, I have a Furman rack mount power conditioner. Below that is where you could place your rack mount IEM transmitters and any antenna combiner and distribution system. In this case, I placed the Sennheiser G-TOUR IEM system here with its rack mount accessories attached. If you're using more than a couple of IEM units, then I'd recommend adding a combiner system to distribute one antenna to feed all of the transmitters. When connecting IEMs, left is always the first connection of a pair. Left, then right. Under the IEM section, I've added something that is hiding. Behind the blank rack panel, I have a 10-inch deep rack mount tray. This gives me a place to neaten the cables up a bit more, and for any power bricks to mount with cable ties or Velcro. In fact, also keeping with the theme of making things neat, on the rear, I added these rack cable management bars. These give me a place to wire tie the cables, keeping all the wiring in place and neat. Finally, I added another small rack mount power strip to the rear. This is not to connect an amp rack, but rather some easy to get to courtesy receptacles for an RF rack, laptop, or charger. Then the 30-foot splitter tail coils up and lives in the bottom of the rack. I mentioned the Midas Stage Connect boxes earlier. They can provide additional outputs, which is ultimately how I will use these. They can also add line level inputs, but no preamps. And they can also be used as a digital splitter in place of the analog splitter snake. Besides the 8 line level inputs, a DN4880-0 plus a DN4888 will give us 24 additional outputs. Essentially, you connect these via an XLR cable, preferably DMX. The wing can power one Stage Connect device itself via the Stage Connect cable. But for extra units, you should use the included power supply with those. As a digital splitter, you'll route them to take their signal directly from the wing rack inputs. 24 wing rack local inputs, feeding 24 Stage Connect outputs. But they do rely on the wing for the signal that they send to front of house. They're utilizing the wing rack preamps. Therefore, your monitor gains need to be set and left alone to not impact front of house. The wing does have a way to mitigate this issue though, because you can set your gain conservatively and then use the trim control for tweaks at the wing.
1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, no change in splitter output.
Trim will change the digital level within the channel to give you the workflow level that you're comfortable with, but not actually changing the physical input gain itself. Also, should something happen and the mixer lose power, then the signal to front of house will be lost. The Stage Connect boxes rely on the wing rack for their signal. An analog splitter snake divides the signals before either console. It stays totally independent of the two consoles. But all that said, if you need to package your wing rack and splitter in an extremely small and portable rack, then the Stage Connect boxes are clearly well designed for that. I think where the Stage Connect boxes really shine is in the expanding of the output capabilities of the wing rack. These two boxes can add 24 more outputs, plus those 8 line level inputs. In fact, just one of these boxes can add 8 to 16 more outputs depending on which box you choose. That's a fairly affordable way to add more monitor mix outputs and add to your ability to utilize several stereo monitor mixes. Let's take a look on the software how you would route some of these things. Let's look at the digital split first. We're on Wing Edit software here, but this will essentially look the same on the console touchscreen itself. So let's first click the routing button. Then make sure we're in the output section and that it's unlocked. I like to use the +1 mode, so I have it enabled. On the left side, choose the Stage Connect outputs. At the bottom, you'll see an option for auto configuration. Auto tends to work fine, but if you click here, you can open a drop-down and manually select the configuration of Stage Connect boxes that you're using. In this case, 24 outputs and 8 line inputs. Then, with our first Stage Connect output selected, we want to go to the right side and choose what it connects to. So for this digital split, we want to choose the local inputs. And then connect each input to the corresponding Stage Connect output. As soon as we make a selection, since +1 is enabled, the output automatically moves to the next slot to await our next assignment. Assign all 24 outputs to local inputs 1 through 24. Add a fan-to-fan snake cable, and this allows our Stage Connect boxes to split our 24 inputs to front of house. And now let's look at using those same two boxes for more console outputs, like you would want for more monitor mixes. So let's go into routing. We want to be in the output section. Then click to unlock the routing, and I'm again choosing the +1 option as well. We've already assigned our local outputs earlier in this video. Now we want to assign our Stage Connect outputs, so let's choose Stage Connect here. We just talked about the configuration option in the last clip, so I'll leave it auto this time. Select the first Stage Connect output to assign if it's not already highlighted. Since we're adding additional bus outputs for monitor mixes, we need to make sure bus is selected from the options now seen on the right here. With the example setup we've already created in this video, we've already used our 8 local outputs. Outputs 1 through 6 are assigned as mono mixes. Outputs 7 and 8 are assigned to the bus 7 stereo mix. If you're adding mono mixes, you'd assign them 1-to-1 here. In this case, I have stereo mixes to assign. So an output gets a left, and then the next output gets a right from each bus. And we start from our first unassigned bus, and that is bus 8 in this example. Of course, you only need to assign how many ever outputs that you're using. Any unassigned outputs could be used elsewhere. Let's say the console was also doing a stream or front of house duties. We'd select main from the options and then assign the main left and right outputs. Before we leave this section, let's look at the switch positions we need to use for these Stage Connect boxes. The quick answer is, at least as far as we're using them in this video, all switches to the left. The wing itself is the master device, so these need to be in slave mode. And we don't want any of the outputs to be duplicated or shared, so we want them in individual mode. Of course, the wing rack also supports expansion through AES-50. So preamps and outputs can be added using Behringer or Midas AES-50 equipped devices. Let's look at another rack configuration. So in my case, as a provider, the way I'm building this rack out, I'm going to keep it flexible for front of house use, as well as a low profile monitor rig. Here, I'm using a Midas Stage Connect box as bus outputs, as well as a left and right output. And I also built this 8-way XLR pass-through panel. This brings the wing rack's local outputs to the front of the Gator rack for easy access. And this also keeps all the outputs together on the front of the rack. Then I can feed IEMs that live in their own rack from here, or feed amps and wedges, or wired IEM belt packs even. So I hope seeing these various rack configurations will give you some ideas for what you might want to do on your own build. I'll leave links for a lot of these items below. I know this video covered a lot of ground, so if you have any questions or comments, leave those below. I'll upload the wing scene that was created here to the Patreon page. If you haven't already, please consider liking and subscribing. Check out the other videos, and I will see you next time.